All right, let's get started on chapter 10. So, this is the last chapter before test 2, although you guys will get a break after that. After test 2, there's the reading break. It's a bit awkward if you're in the Thursday class, but Friday is always test review day, so tomorrow from 2:30 to 4, there will be test review in N2201. So some of you didn't do as well on the first test. I would encourage you to take advantage of that and or to take advantage of course questions on Blackboard. So if you have time between today and tomorrow, try to test yourself on the key terms for the 2 chapters, and so 9 and 10, and then bring any questions you have to me tomorrow, or 2 course questions later. Additionally, remind me if I forget. I'm supposed to tell you what the written question will be today. So today the topic is intelligence, and relatedly IQ tests. So we'll start at the most basic level. What do psychologists mean by the term intelligence? So one fact that you discover very quickly is psychologists do not agree about how to define intelligence, which is kind of a problem. Agreement about definitions is important. But if you survey the literature and look at the different definitions, you'll find that some convergence. Psychologists define intelligence as a kind of ability, specifically a kind of cognitive ability. The ability to solve cognitively difficult problems. In fact, in many papers, you will see cognitive ability used synonymously with intelligence. The way that the book catches that out is it's the ability to solve novel problems and learn from experience. So that's roughly how psychologists define intelligence. So that's kind of the theoretical definition, if you like. You'll remember from chapter 2 that in psychology we try to give operational definitions, so definitions that are precise and measurable, and the most common way of operationalizing intelligence is as an IQ score. So we have these standardized tests called IQ tests that we'll talk a lot about in this chapter, and that's a measurable way of operationalizing this variable. And I want to say something up front about this chapter. For various reasons that will become clear as we go through it, this is one of the most difficult chapters to talk about. Not as far as difficult to learn, but there are various controversies related to it. And there's a bit of a paradox. On the one hand, by the standards of psychology, IQ tests are some of the best tests that we have. As far as reliability and validity, which I'll say more about soon, they rank pretty highly. But on the other hand, there is a long history of misusing IQ tests, which makes it a potentially uncomfortable topic. Many of you may have heard of eugenics. Have any of you heard of eugenics? So various Western countries had eugenics programs. These are programs designed to increase the frequency of good genes, sort of to do evolution by force. And one thing that was done is they would give people different tests, including IQ tests, and sterilize people who scored low, prevent them from having kids. This was done right here in Canada. Alberta had their eugenics program in effect until the 70s, so not that long ago. Hence, the need for caution. I'm more of a morning person than a night person. In my Monday class, which is the evening class, and my brain wasn't working right, I said that Alberta euthanized people with low IQs instead of sterilized, and I saw looks of horror. I was like, oh wait, no, you sterilized. Still bad, but Alberta wasn't quite that bad. So I'll actually start off with a video that goes through some of this problematic history. It's good information and good stuff to keep in mind. Okay, so there were a number of different terms that came up there. Don't worry if you didn't get all of them. We'll be talking about a lot of those as we go through. For example, we'll talk about the Flynn effect around the middle of the chapter. So one name that was mentioned in that video is Alfred Binet. He was the first one to put together, they weren't called IQ tests yet, but cognitive ability tests. As the video mentioned, this was done in France, Binet was a Frenchman, to identify which kids were likely to need help. France was one of the first countries to have universal education, and they wanted a quick and efficient way of figuring out who was likely to need help. So that's a perfectly benign use for these kinds of tests. It was later that someone whose name you don't need to know, William Stern, put the Q in the IQ, if you like. Can anyone tell me, what does the Q stand for? Anyone know? So I is intelligence, Q is? Quotient, yes. So what's a quotient? It's like a division, right? So it's the result of an equation. The older ones used what's called ratio IQ. This is one of the key terms. This is an equation you do need to know for the test, but it's not very scary. It's mental age divided by chronological age multiplied by 100. So let's go through the two ingredients. So mental age, actually chronological age is easier to do first. Chronological age is your actual age. So how many years have passed since you were born? Mental age is the age at which you're scoring. So if you get the same score on these mental ability tests that the average 15-year-old does, then you have a mental age of 15. So let's say there's someone named Susan, and Susan does as well as the average 15-year-old, but her chronological age is 10. So she's actually 10 years old. And before doing any math, you should have the sense that, okay, Susan is smart, right? So 15 divided by 10, 1.5. 1.5 multiplied by 100, 150. So nothing too fancy. Notice that by definition, the average will be 100, right? If your mental age and chronological age are the same, that means you're getting the same score as the average person your age, so you're average. And anything divided by itself will be 1. 1 multiplied by 100 is 100. So it's an equation you have to know. Any questions about ratio IQ? So this is good for kids, but the equation is kind of silly if applied to adults. Suppose someone is 20 years old, but they get the same score as the average 40-year-old. Well, then they should be, in theory, really smart, like have an IQ of 200, but that seems silly. In fact, adults, especially on the speed type of tests, do worse as they get older. So this would not work for adults. So what's used nowadays is deviation IQ. I used to give students the equation for this, but then I never put it on the test, so I felt like I was just being mean. So if you want to know the equation, you can look at my Psych 105 lectures, or you can just ask me. But here's all you need to know for the test. This defines IQ in terms of how many standard deviations from the mean you are. So hence deviation IQ. how many standard deviations away from the mean are you? However, these ones still by convention make the average 100. That's a convention that has stayed the same. In fact, they get samples every few years and re-norm the test to make sure that the average is 100. Like they're literally made like that. Okay, I see no hands. Next, we're going to build on two concepts that we talked about in chapter 2, reliability and validity. So in chapter 2, these got a cursory treatment, but now we're going to break these down into subtypes. I'll be nice early. The written question in test 2 is about this. So there's reliability and validity. So I'll start zoomed out, and then we'll get into some subtypes. Reliability is about how consistent a measurement is or a test is. Or, put worded better, does the test yield consistent results? So I gave a silly example in class of defining IQ as pinky toe length, and that would be a highly reliable test because every time you do the measurement, you'll get pretty much the same result. What that silly test would lack is validity, where validity means, in this context, is the test measuring what it's supposed to measure? But we can do better. We can break both of these down into other types. One type of validity is test-retest reliability. This is the simplest one. It's usually the example that's used to explain reliability. You give someone the test at one time, give them the test later, and see if you get similar scores. So give someone the IQ test on Monday, give it to them next Friday, do they get a similar score? You can also think of it as a correlation. You can get a sample of people, not just one person, look at their IQ score at time 1 and their IQ score at time 2, and what you want is a close correlation. It won't be perfect, right? Maybe they had some bad pizza the first time they took the IQ test and then do better the second time or whatever. But you want there to be a close correlation. That would mean the test has high test-retest reliability. So you can think of it in terms of a correlation, or if it's easier to explain on the test, think of it as one person. He takes the test on one day, does he get a similar score when he takes it the next day? Whatever is more intuitive for you. But suppose that we're lazy and we don't want to give them the test again. You can also look at, and this is probably the most commonly used in practice, you can look at internal reliability. This is about how much the items within the test correlate with each other. So hence internal, right? It's within the test. You're not comparing it to another time they take the test. So put in intuitive terms, if someone does really well in the first half of the test, do they do well in the second half of the test? Or is it kind of random? If it's random, it would have low internal reliability. So for whatever it's worth, IQ tests do quite well in this, for reasons we'll look at later. Items within IQ tests are strongly positively correlated, meaning if you know how well someone does on one part, you can make a pretty good guess about how well they do on other parts, which means it has high internal reliability. Final one, inter-judge, sometimes called inter-rater reliability. people should get the same score, or roughly the same score, regardless of who gives them the test or administers the test. So let's say you're doing an IQ test, and I give it to you, and you get a score of 123. Jill gives you the test, and you get 65. Okay, bad interjudge or interrater reliability. The test should be sufficiently clear that the same result is obtained regardless of who administers the test. I see some looks of puzzlement. Any questions about, well, any of these, but in particular the last one? Yep.
What was the one before this one?
Internal?
Yeah.
Yeah, so internal is how much do or how strongly do the items within the test correlate with each other. One way of doing this is split half reliability. So you can randomly split the items in the test into two halves. Do those two halves correlate with each other? If they don't, or if they correlate very lowly, that's low internal reliability. Validity is a more difficult beast. There's more controversy about how best to think about validity. The simplest kind of validity, which is especially important in the early stages of test creation, is face validity. So in law, there's the term prima facie, or first face. So it just means you look at something, does it seem a certain way? So face validity is you haven't done any sophisticated theory or fancy statistics. You just look at the test items and ask yourself, does it seem like they are measuring the right thing? So let's say I'm interested in measuring extroversion, how extroverted someone is. And there's a bunch of questions about how much SpongeBob you watch. Okay, that doesn't seem like it's measuring extroversion. If it has questions about how much you like people, how confident you are, how often you get bored if you're by yourself, okay, it sure looks like it's a good measure of extroversion. A student in the Monday class said, so basically first impressions. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Face validity is first impressions. Next kind of validity is content validity. And whenever you see content validity, you should almost just mentally insert brackets before content with the words all of the content. A test has content validity if it measures the full range of what it's supposed to measure. There's a fancier way of saying that. The idea is that it's the way you'll see it in some books is it's a representative sample of the universe of content, but don't worry about that. Just think of it as, is it measuring the full range of what it's supposed to measure? Here's an example that matters to all of you. There will be a cumulative final in this class. You want that final to have content validity. If I give you a cumulative final and all of the questions are from chapter 2, that would have low content validity. In the case of an IQ test, you could imagine a test that only included vocabulary items. And you'd say, wait, but there's no math problems, no spatial problems, no logic problems. This isn't measuring the full range of what we mean by intelligence. The last one, in my experience, is the one that psychologists are most impressed with, and that's criterion validity. Criterion validity is, does the test correlate with something that it should be correlated with? That other thing is called the criterion. the thing that it's supposed to be correlated with. So, in the case of IQ tests, the most commonly used criterion is grades, school grades. It's an easy one to use. The idea here would be, if these IQ tests are valid, if they're really measuring intelligence, they should be correlated with school grades. Now, this is psychology, the correlation is never 1 or even close to 1, but if the correlation was close to 0 between IQ tests and grades, okay, these tests are no good. That's the idea. It should be able to correlate with something like that. To take an example from personality, again, think of an extroversion test. Let's say you have a scale that measures extroversion and you want to know if it's any good. Well, it should be correlated with things like how many parties you go to. If the correlation is 0 or close to 0, well, this test is no good. That's the idea. This breaks down into 2 different types. The distinction is very simple, but you'll sometimes see these terms used. So these are both types of criterion validity, and here's the difference. Concurrent validity, if you're interested in concurrent validity, you look at whether the 2 things are that are being correlated or measured at the same time. So, is the test correlated with something it should be correlated with right now? Predictive, is the test correlated with something in the future that it should be correlated with? So, simple case, I look for a correlation between IQ score and grades. Obviously I won't do this, but if I gave everyone in the class an IQ test and asked for your GPA now, that would be concurrent validity. If I give you the IQ test now and measure your GPA in 2 years, that's predictive validity. Right, because predict means about the future. Okay, the last type of validity is kind of, well, I won't say kind of, it's the most theoretical of the different types, and that's construct validity. Construct validity is what psychologists have in the back of their head when they're looking at these other types. It's what they're really interested in. These other types of validity that I just finished talking about can be taken as indirect pieces of evidence for construct validity. Construct validity is the test measuring the right theoretical construct? So we have some theoretical definition of intelligence, which I'll put like in a bubble, like a cloud bubble. So it's theoretical, and one problem in psychology is the theories we have are typically not as precise and well defined as theories in physics. But something like what I said at the beginning of the chapter, right? Cognitive ability, the ability to solve problems, some kind of theoretical definition like that. And then we have this measure, an IQ test, which is precise and well defined, right? It's your score on this test. Does this measure this? That's construct validity. Does this test that we made measure the theoretical construct we have? Now I'll just note, there are academics who think, this one's too theoretical and we should focus more on the ones that are more precise and well defined. But construct validity is, as I say, what psychologists usually have in the back of their head when they're thinking about validity. Okay. Any questions about the different types of reliability and validity? So here's what the written will look like, and if this prompts a question, please raise your hand. I'll just say something like, suppose someone makes a new IQ test. What would it mean for that test to have these different types of reliability and validity? It won't be all of them, it'll be a sample of 5. So be ready for any of these. That's what the written will be. There you go. I see no hands, so I'll move on. So, how do IQ tests do on these fronts? And I'll focus on 2 types of reliability and validity. I'll put this up. Criterion validity and test-retest reliability. And these numbers are good to know. Nudge, nudge, hint, hint. So as far as test-retest reliability goes, IQ tests are very high. If the time of taking the tests is 2 to 12 weeks, the correlation is about 0.95, which is almost 1. So by the standards of psychology, that's very high. It's a bit lower if you spread it out by decades. So there was one big study that looked at the correlation if you take it at age 9 and then again at age 40. And there, the correlation is 0.7 to 0.8. Still quite high, but obviously less. But in most studies where it's not quite that spread out, the correlation is around 0.9, sometimes higher. So for test-retest, it's very high. For criterion validity, which again is, does the test correlate with things that it should be correlated with, it's pretty good by the standards of psychology, but the correlations aren't that big. Depends on which sample you look at. So I should say, here I'm speaking about the correlation between IQ and grades. I mentioned that's one of the most common ones to look at. So the correlation between IQ scores and grades is almost always around 0.5. So not close to 1, but definitely not 0. And I'll just say, one thing you'll often see, people often get in heated debates about this. You will hear some people say, oh, IQ tests only measure your ability to take IQ tests. And then others will try to build up how important IQ tests are. Both of those extremes are wrong. It's definitely not true that IQ tests only measure your ability to take IQ tests. I mean, if that was true, it would be true of literally everything in psychology. But it's also true that IQ tests leave a lot of the variation unexplained. And the next thing I'm going to say you don't need to know for the test, I mean, the general size of reliability and validity is good to know, but this next bit is for the nerds. So a correlation is called a Pearson's R, the kind, it's a linear correlation. If you ever see a Pearson's R, like a correlation like this, one good thing to do is square it in your head. So multiply it by itself. If you square a decimal, it gets smaller. So you get what's called R squared. R squared is how much of the variation in the y variable is explained by the other. So let me show a picture. So I'll show some real data of what this correlation looks like. So here's real data, if it works. So there's a sample of students. The y-axis is GPA, x-axis is IQ. So as you can see, the correlation is close to 0.5. And there's definitely a trend But as you all can see, there's also a lot of variation. And this number, r squared, which again, is just for the nerds if you're curious, what this means, so it's 0.25, 0.5 squared is 0.25. That means that 25% of the variation in grades is explainable in terms of its relationship with IQ. Put another way, 75% of the variation in grades, the remaining 75% of the variation in grades, is unrelated to IQ. So IQ doesn't explain nothing, it explains some of the variance, and by the standards of psychology, 25% is quite a bit, but it's not everything. It leaves a lot unexplained. That's the right view to take of the importance of IQ. Actually, I have some other stuff from the book. So when it comes to the correlation with income, the correlation is weaker. So there is a correlation between IQ and income, but it's more like 0.3. And with this one, you kind of have to squint to see it. X-axis is IQ again, and then income is the y-axis. And if you squint, you can see that, as you get higher in IQ, on average, you make more money, but not as strong. Okay, so that's a bit about how valid and reliable the tests are. Any questions about this? So what the heck are on these tests? So the most commonly used IQ test today, which goes back to a man named David Wechsler, is the WAIS 4th edition, Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. And you should know the components of the WAIS. So there's 4 big components, which then break down further, but focus on remembering the big 4. The 4 index scales that together add up to your full scale IQ. And I'll give some examples of each. You don't have to memorize the examples, but they'll give you a flavor of what's on these tests. So the first index scale, which has 3 subtests, is the verbal comprehension index, which, as its name indicates, is about language-related tests. So one subtest is just vocabulary, right, straightforward. Information, so how many facts you know about different subjects. And one item that I'll show some examples of is similarities. So here are some questions from the similarities part. These are on the easier side. What do an hour and a year have in common? What do a fish and a crow have in common? So for the hour and year, you're supposed to say they're both units of time. What do a poem and a statue have in common? And they will get progressively harder. So that's an example of something in the verbal comprehension index. The next one is working memory. So working memory is essentially the same as short-term memory in psychology. So this is how much can you hold in your head as you're solving a problem or as you're working on a problem. So one test here is doing arithmetic in your head. If you're doing an arithmetic problem, a harder one, you have to do one step, remember the solution to the first step, and then keep doing the second step. That's the kind of ability that the working memory index is getting at. And another component that's simple, it's called the digit span. So I should say, when you're doing the WAIS, you can't do it on paper and pencil or online. You have to have someone administering it to you. So one component is the test administrator will read a series of numbers to you, and you have to say them back. So, if I was giving it to you, it'd be like, 4826. You go 4826, and then next 95071. You have to repeat it back. And the digit spans will get increasingly long, the number of digits you have to say back. And what's being measured is how many can you get right? How long is it before you start making mistakes? And average score here is 7. Pretty reliably. Most people are 7 or close to 7. So that's the working memory index. The next one, which is more visually based, is perceptual reasoning index. So I'll give a few examples of this. One example, and we'll see another example that's similar later, is matrix reasoning. So you look at the 4 squares there, one of them has a question mark. There's a particular pattern that you can detect, and then you have to select which of the 5 options would best complete that pattern. So this is an example of a non-verbal test. So for example, if you're administering an IQ test to someone who doesn't speak English, you would probably pay, if the test is administered in English normally, you might pay more attention to something like this. Another example where they actually use physical objects is block design. This is also under the perceptual reasoning umbrella. They'll actually give you 9 blocks like this, and you have to use them to make the pattern you see on the other in the other picture. And this one is timed. Some tests are timed, some are not. Here it's not whether you get it. Most people get it eventually, but how quickly can you do it? The next one, next umbrella, both of the tests are timed, is processing speed index. So here, speed is the name of the game. So I'll show one example, which is symbol search. And again, you don't have to memorize these names, just the 4 index scales. So there are 60 rows like this. On one side, you'll see 2 symbols. You have to look at the other side and see if at least one of those 2 is there, and then circle yes or no. You have 2 minutes, and you have to do as many as you can. And the question is, how many do you get right in that period of time? You won't get to the end, so hence it's about speed. Okay. Any questions about the structure of the ways? One of the most important figures in the history of intelligence research is someone named Charles Spearman. He developed a technique while he was analyzing these data that is now used outside of psychology a lot. So it was a very important contribution. And that technique that he developed is called factor analysis. This is very important to understand. It'll come up again in the personality chapter. So what I'm going to say now would not be good enough for a statistics class. I'm going to try and give you an intuitive sense of how this works, and that's good enough for the test you'll take here. If you go on and take statistics, you'll learn this at a higher level. Suppose I gave all of you the following 4 questions. First, I asked, how much alcohol, or how many drinks of alcohol, have you had in the last month? Now I'm going to use multiple colors, really advanced, high-tech stuff here. I also ask you how much marijuana you have had in the last month. I ask how many parties you have been to in the last month. And I ask How many pairs of black shoes do you own? Here's something I would bet is true. I don't know for sure, but I would bet. If I gave these 4 questions to you all, people who gave higher answers to this one, on average, will give higher answers to this one. People who have had more to drink in the last month probably have also smoked more marijuana than average in the last month. And probably have been to more parties than average in the last month. So in other words, these 3 are probably positively correlated. The last one, probably very little correlation to the other 3. How many black shoes you own is probably not correlated with how much marijuana you smoke. Maybe it is, but that would be my bet. So here's what factor analysis, this is what factor analysis gets at. It allows you to extract factors that explain correlations between test items. So you could probably extract a, I'll call it a, having fun factor, so to speak, that would explain why these 3 are positively correlated. And again, what I'm about to draw would not be exactly what it would look like, but probably these 3 would be sort of statistically close, right? They go together, and this one would probably not load highly on the factor. It would be unrelated to the other 3. It would not load highly on the, having fun or foolishness factor. Does that make intuitive sense? Again, you don't have to know how to actually do this, but do you see what I'm getting at with the idea of factor analysis? So here's what Spearman did. He applied this technique to the kinds of questions we just saw, the kinds of questions on IQ tests, and looked at how they go together. And you can imagine this going different ways. It could be that, for example, math and verbal items are uncorrelated. They're totally unrelated. People who are good at math are average or bad at verbal items. You can imagine it turning out that way. But in fact, one of the most well-replicated findings in this area is all mental ability tests are positively correlated. If you give samples of people verbal items, spatial problems, math problems, you find there's one cluster of items. They're all positively correlated. We'll see later that when it comes to personality, the consensus now is that the data are best explained by treating the items as belonging to 5 clusters of questions. So the dominant theory in personality psychology today is the Big 5, which, how many of you have heard of the Big 5? A handful. So we'll talk about that in the personality chapter, but with mental ability tests, you get one major dimension. Spearman's term for this is the G factor, which was mentioned in the video, also called general intelligence or general cognitive ability. So people who are higher in the G factor tend to do well on all of the test items. And as an analogy that might make intuitive sense, you could do the same thing with sports. So all of you have spent time in PE classes, and yes, some people are, really good at running and not so good at weightlifting, or really good at throwing but not so good, whatever, right? But there are some kids who are just more athletic. They're kind of good at, the high jump. They're good at lifting weights, good at running, etc. They'd be high in the, fitness G factor, if you like. So Spearman here extracted it for mental ability tests. But if you zoom in, you can break it down into further factors too. So the G factor does explain a large amount of the variance, but there are also what Spearman called S factors, or specific abilities. So, yes, it is still true that vocabulary items correlate more strongly with other vocabulary items than they do with math problems. So, verbal ability would be an S factor. So here's a helpful picture of how this plays itself out. So the overlap between the different types of questions is the G factor. So there's like numerical, so like math ability, verbal ability, spatial ability. The extent to which they overlap is what's explained by the G factor. The extent to which they're separate is what's explained by the S factor. Spearman is more famous for his discovery of the G factor, but he also had the idea of S factors. Any questions on Spearman? Another important distinction is the distinction between crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence is how much stuff do you know? So imagine your brain is like a warehouse full of facts. And the facts are like little objects that are collected inside the warehouse. How big is your stash of facts that you know and stuff that you know? And you can think of them as like solid objects or solid structures, hence, crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is dynamic. It's how good are you at solving new problems? How good are you at reasoning through new kinds of questions? Now, as with other ability tests, they are positively correlated, and you can imagine different reasons why that's the case. So one theory you could have is that some people are born with more fluid intelligence, and as a result they learn more stuff as they walk through the world. You could explain the correlation in other ways, but conceptually at least they are distinct. And I'll give some examples of fluid to make this more clear. So one of the best IQ tests, subtests to give is the Raven's progressive matrices. So some IQ tests or subtests are more strongly correlated with the other ones. In other words, if you're only going to give one, these would be better ones to give. So I won't test you on this, but for example, the digit span, how many numbers you can repeat back, is not that strongly correlated with the other tests. Vocabulary, quite highly correlated with how well you do on the other tests. This one is one of the best. It's called the Raven's progressive matrices. It starts off easier, so this is one of the easier ones. As we saw earlier, there's a pattern you're supposed to detect, and you have to figure out which one would go in the last one. So, as you should be able to see, in the first two rows, it's rotating clockwise. So the same thing should happen in the last one, and they will progressively increase in difficulty, and this would be an example of a more difficult one. So this is a classic example of a fluid intelligence question. Most of you, I assume, have never seen this before. So it's not about how many facts you know, it's about how good you are at solving a new problem. I won't put you all on the spot and ask you to solve it, but that would be an example. Does that distinction make sense? Okay, there are, so Spearman is most famous for identifying the G factor. The next two people we're going to look at, you can think of them as being people who zoomed in on the S factors and tried to emphasize their importance. One of them is not in the book. He was in the textbook I learned from, and there are different criticisms of his work, but he's good to know. He's a very famous psychologist in this area and was very influential in education. The controversy relates to, does it make semantic sense to call some of these things intelligences? Some people say you should call these talents, but leaving that aside, it's a very famous theory. This is Howard Gardner, who had a theory of multiple intelligences. The first three are measured by standard IQ tests, the others are not. Just as kind of a funny idea that's consistent with Gardner. This is a comic. Always takes a second. Our education system. For a fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And as you can see, the monkey's very happy, but no one else is. So Gardner's classification works like this. There's linguistic intelligence, so which is having to do with language. So something like the verbal comprehension index would be an example of that. Logical mathematical, which is exactly what it sounds like. So how good are you with logic and mathematics? I think in the key terms I say visuospatial. Sometimes Gardner just says spatial, but same thing. This is how good you are at manipulating and solving spatial problems. So some of the fluid intelligence questions we saw would be examples of measurement of spatial intelligence. So these three are all represented in standard IQ tests. The others would not. So Gardner thought it made sense to speak of musical intelligence. Some people challenge us and say, that's just a talent, it's not an intelligence. His line is, well, why is it that if you're good with words, that's an intelligence, but if you're good with other kinds of sounds, it doesn't count? You can have a semantic debate about that, but that's the argument that he made. Bodily kinesthetic, which is essentially hand-eye coordination. How good are you at using your body? Next two are easy to mix up. Interpersonal and intrapersonal. So inter means between. Intra means within. So interpersonal means skill with other people. So you're good at understanding other people, dealing effectively with other people. So what we might colloquially call social skills would fall under interpersonal intelligence. Intrapersonal is good insight and understanding of yourself. So skill with understanding one's own emotional responses, things like that would fall under intrapersonal intelligence. And the last one, naturalistic intelligence. So naturalistic meaning skill with the natural world. So people who are naturally good at, being things like sorry. Don't you hate it when there's like a sneeze right here and it won't come out? I don't believe in hell, but if there is a hell, I think that's it. You just have to sneeze for eternity and never get to it. Anyway, so this would people who would make good biologists, geologists, or bird watchers. They're good at classifying the natural world. They would fall in that bucket. Any questions about Gardner? Another way of dividing things up comes from Sternberg, who divided it into 3. And look, this is partly a matter of choice, right? And if you wanted, you could say that every subtest is a different kind of intelligence. So it depends how you want to carve up the space. Sternberg distinguished between analytical, practical, and creative intelligence. So analytical would include these 3. So analytical intelligence is the kind of intelligence measured by standard IQ tests. Practical intelligence is what we might colloquially call street smarts. So people who are good at solving everyday types of problems. So you're good at fixing stuff, good at doing a job interview, good at navigating a new area, stuff like that would fall under what he called practical intelligence. So graduate students, high in the first one, low in this one, can't think their way out of a paper bag in the real world. And then creative intelligence is what it sounds like. This is skill with generating new ideas or new solutions. Okay, one other one that's also the subject of some controversy as far as whether it makes sense to call this an intelligence is emotional intelligence. So there are different scales that purport to measure how good people are at recognizing emotions in others or at dealing with one's own emotions. One thing that's been looked at, now I'll say this term you don't have to know, this is another one for the nerds, I guess. So I talked earlier about predictive validity, so like, or criterion validity, I guess is the more broad one. Does the test correlate with something that it should be correlated with? There's also incremental criterion validity. Which is, does the test correlate with something that it should be correlated with some criterion? So in the case of IQ tests, it's does the test correlate with grades? But incremental is, does it still correlate with those things after you control for other variables? So in the case of emotional intelligence, what some people alleged is that emotional intelligence is really just normal intelligence measured by IQ tests plus extroversion. So if you're extroverted and smart, you'll get emotional intelligence for free, so to speak. So what you can do is statistically control for IQ scores and extroversion and see if the emotional intelligence test still correlates with criteria. And I'm not an expert in this area. My understanding is that, in fact, they still do. So these tests would have incremental criterion validity. But as I say, if that gave you a headache, none of that is testable. But as far as emotional intelligence, I'll show an example of a similar kind of test. So we'll have some fun. So one measure is called the reading the mind and the eyes test. And it's about how good you are at recognizing emotions when you can only see the eyes. So there's a set of pictures, and the question is, how good are you at recognizing the emotions in the eyes? This is used to screen for autism because autism is associated with difficulty in recognizing emotional expressions. There's also a sex difference on this one. Women on average score more highly on this test. The person who developed this test is named Simon Baron Cohen. How many of you know who Sacha Baron Cohen is? Like Borat, Bruno, those movies. So his cousin is probably the world's expert on autism. And he once said that to be male is to have a mild form of autism. That's funny. So I'll show you some of the stimuli. Okay, so there's a face. Which of the 4 emotions is this face showing? Anyone brave enough to say? Someone guess. There'll be no judgment if you get it wrong. Someone thinks comforting. I actually don't remember. I'm pretty sure it's playful. There is an answer key at the end. So if you want to double check me, you can look at the answer key at the end. How about this one? I vaguely heard someone say upset. So upset is, I'm pretty sure, correct in this case. Hey, what about this one? So I think I heard someone say it. Someone be more confident. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so desire. So now I show this in part because there's a funny story with this one. I gave this test to my mom and dad to see how well they would do. I was kind of curious. The sex difference was replicated. My mom did better than my dad. But the exception was ones like this. For some reason, my dad always got these ones right. So you can make it that way. Well, so anyways, that's just an example. As another kind of funny story, I was in the early stages of talking with a girl, and she said to me, "You seem emotionally underdeveloped." And exactly, right? So I went to my mom and I was like, "Mom, this is outrageous. This girl says that I am emotionally underdeveloped." And my mom said, "Oh, so she's very intelligent." So that's the way my family is. Lots of savagery. Okay, so the next section deals with the issue of potential cultural bias in tests. So one obvious case that we've already seen in the video, if someone is taking the test in a language that's not their first language, that's obviously an issue. But there are more subtle examples. One famous one that you'll find in a lot of textbooks is the following question. Now, I think this one was from an SAT test, not an IQ test, but they're highly correlated. A runner is to a marathon as a blank is to a blank. So these two have a relationship. You then have multiple pairs of words. Which pair has the same relationship? So the options included, an envoy is to an embassy, a martyr is to a massacre, and the right answer is oarsman and regatta. Now, a regatta is a boat race, but it's kind of a rich man's game. It's associated with a particular level of socioeconomic status. So many allege that this question is not really measuring intelligence, it's measuring class. And therefore it's not a fair question to include. So this is the kind of thing that psychometricians argue about. Are the items culture fair? One solution you might think to use is to rely on the nonverbal items. So, I showed you various tests that are spatial problems where language isn't involved. But even there, you can't be so sure. So, the video mentioned the Flynn effect, which we're going to talk about later. Just to say briefly, the Flynn effect refers to the fact that IQ scores have gone up in the last 100 years, quite substantially. Well, at least the raw scores. They re-norm it every few years, so the average is 100, but if you look at raw scores, we've been getting better. And you might think, oh yeah, probably the information stuff, we know more facts because we're more well educated. But in fact, almost the opposite. So here's not the whole Flynn effect, but a subset of the years, so 1947 to 2002. At the bottom, that line that's almost flat is information, arithmetic, and vocabulary. So it's barely gone up. At the top, is the Raven's progressive matrices, which is this that I showed earlier. So that one has gone up the most. You could imagine different explanations for why that is. But this is just to say that the environment can even affect things like that. The kinds of problems you're used to solving can, in this case, quite substantially affect performance, even on items like that. Because, as I'm going to say later, the Flynn effect, there's debate about what it's due to, but one thing it cannot be due to is genetic changes. It has to be due to something in the environment, simply because the length of time is not enough for evolution to take place. Okay, so let's take a break here. Next, we're going to talk about the nature-nurture debate in relation to IQ tests. So let's come back at 10:55. Okay, everyone, 10:55, let's keep going. So, as I said, we'll now start the section on the nature-nurture debate, as it's popularly called. So, we talk about this more in 1100. I'm actually talking about the same topic this afternoon in 1100, but in more detail. But broadly speaking, the nature-nurture debate is about human differences. As you all have noticed from being alive, people are different. Some people are taller than others, have different personalities, various other traits. And the question is, why are people different? And if you take the nature side, you think that people are different because of their genetic endowment. People have different genes, different constitutions, and if you're on that side, you think that's why people are different. If you're on the nurture side, you think that it has to do with differences in the environment. Now, psychologists tend not to actually use these terms. We divide up the variation into three sources of variation. We split the environment into two buckets. So the three buckets are genes as a source of variation. A related term that we're going to talk about is heritability, which is very important. Very easy to misunderstand, but very important. There's the shared environment, which is the environment shared by siblings, and the non-shared environment. Which is a big umbrella which includes everything that's not genes and not the shared environment. So for the shared environment, this would include things like how your parents treat you, at least to the extent that they treat their kids the same, what neighborhood they live in, what school the kids go to. Those all fall under the umbrella of the shared environment. So everything else is the non-shared. So this could include, a particular teacher you had. It could include a particular niche group of friends that you have but your siblings don't. It could also include just random events. You ride your bike, you fall off your bike, you hit your head. Well, that does change who you are, and it can influence your personality in different ways, and that would technically fall under the non-shared environment. So how do we get at these different sources of variation? So I'll start with the first one, genes or heritability. And later I'm going to add some caveats to these numbers, but the simplest way to estimate heritability is to look at different sorts of twin studies. So how many of you remember twin studies from 1100? So the simplest one, although you get smaller samples, is you look at identical twins, or monozygotic twins, that are raised apart. So monozygotic means one zygote. So when a sperm hits an egg, that cell is called a zygote. It's the first stage of development. So mono means one, so one zygote splits into two babies, two people. That's identical twins. So therefore they share all of their DNA. They came from the same sperm and egg. So they share 100% of their DNA. Dizygotic twins result from two sperm and two eggs, so they're separate, and they are as similar as siblings, as ordinary siblings. They share half of their DNA. So think about the case of identical twins raised apart. So they're adopted, but they're adopted by different families. They share 100% of their DNA, but none of the shared environment. Right? They grow up in different homes. So think through the logic of this. If genes play no role in generating a given trait, personality, IQ score, height, whatever, then the twins should not be similar. But in fact, for pretty much every psychological trait you can measure, they are similar. Not 100%, but substantially similar. And you can use this, as well as other methods, to get an estimate of the heritability of a given trait. So that's one method. Look at identical twins raised apart. Another method is forget about adoption. Think about kids raised in the same family. And think about monozygotic twins versus dizygotic twins. So these are cases where they do share the shared environment, the home environment. If genes play no role in influencing a trait, these two should be equally similar, because the extra genes shouldn't make a difference. But again, for every trait, pretty much every trait we can measure, the monozygotic twins are substantially more similar than the dizygotic twins. So those extra genes make a difference. And you can use these things to get estimates of heritability. So, for example, in the case of identical twins raised apart, the book says that the correlation is about 0.78 between their IQ scores, showing substantial genetic influence. There is an equation for getting an estimate of heritability by comparing the similarity of these twins to the similarity of these twins. I won't tell you that. Don't worry about it, but if you're curious, you can ask during office hours or look at my old lectures. But if you use these different methods, the numbers you usually get are in the range of 50 to 70% heritability for IQ scores. So pretty substantial. And one thing I'll note that I'm going to bring up again later, that number tends to go up with age. If you ever see a study on heritability, look at the age of the participants. Generally speaking, and the book has a graph that shows this, that number goes up with age. So that's the number. And I'll mention too, in the case of these two, most people assume that the shared environment will be where the action is. But believe it or not, for virtually every trait, the effect of the non-shared environment is larger than the effect of the shared environment. And that's true for IQ scores too, especially if you look at adults. So what that means is the effect of growing up in the same home on a trait is smaller than the effect of all the other things that happen in your life. Now, many people are surprised by that. They assume that parenting and other things like that have a large role. And this is less important in this chapter. I talk more about it in 1100. But here's an example that might make that more intuitive. Think about the children of immigrants. So people, let's say in our case, born in Canada, but whose parents are from another country. The parents, if they speak English at all, speak it with an accent. The kids have their peers and the parents. As the kids grow up, who do they sound like? The parents or the peers? And the answer is almost always the peers if they're born here. So often it's factors outside of the home that have a bigger chunk of the variance. So again, I'll say as an aside, for most traits in psychology, 50% or less is due to genes, and around 50% due to this. Often the effect of the shared environment is close to 0. Don't worry about that too much for this class, but that's often what you find. But now I want to add some caveats about this idea of heritability. So I mentioned, IQ scores are 50 to 70% heritable. I want to say what that means and what it doesn't mean. The first thing that's very crucial is heritability estimates are about differences between people. They're about variation. So forget about intelligence or IQ scores, think about height. So people have different heights, as you have all noticed. If you use these twin type studies, the estimate of heritability is around 90%. That doesn't mean that for me, this much of my height is due to genes. It's not clear that even makes sense. What it means is, let's say we measured it in this class. Let's say we ranked everyone from shortest to tallest. So there's variation, there's differences between us in height. The heritability number is how much of those differences are due to genes. So I'm taller than Jimmy, John's taller than me, whatever. How much of the differences between people are due to genes? So it's about differences or variation. I will say, if, on questions on the test, I forget if there's one in 1200 on this, but people often confuse this. Any questions about this first important caveat? Okay, another one, very important. Heritability can change based on the environment. I'll just say So these numbers are not fixed. They are not like laws of physics. To be more specific, environmental contexts that have more poverty or deprivation usually result in lower heritability numbers. So here's an example. Height, as I mentioned, is around 90% heritable, but that's only true in developed countries. There are studies in places like rural India where there's more poverty, and there the number can be as low as 40%, meaning only 40% of the variation in height is due to genes. And the way to think about that is, if there's more malnourishment, people are not reaching their full genetic potential, and therefore there's less genetic contribution to variation in the trait. The same is true for IQ scores. So I mentioned 50 to 70%. The number is lower if you focus on people who live in low socioeconomic status. If you look just at poor kids, the heritability numbers are lower, presumably for a similar reason, right? If you're poor, you're not reaching your full genetic potential vis-a-vis IQ scores, and therefore genes are explaining less of the variance. Any questions about that? Okay, another thing that's been looked at that's related is brain variables that explain some of the differences in IQ. So one thing that's been looked at for a long time with some controversy is brain size. Some of the early studies were kind of goofy, like they would take skulls and put balls in it. Now we have better methods. And here the correlations are somewhat modest. So if you look at brain size and IQ scores, the correlation you get is something like 0.3 to 0.4. So not nothing, but not especially high. Interestingly, it's higher for the G factor. So if you look specifically at the G factor, you get numbers closer to 0.6, though still not. Well, it's never 1 in psychology. one reason we know that brain size isn't everything, as I'll mention later, for males and females, the average IQ is the same, 100, but males have larger brains on average, even when controlling for body size. One conjecture that's been put forward is that it might even out because there's evidence that women have more dense interconnections. For example, the corpus callosum is thicker, which connects the two hemispheres, so it may be accomplished in different ways. It's not always about size per se, but amount of connections can also matter. Another thing that's been studied, and then there's a long history of people hypothesizing about this, is neural efficiency. So again, this isn't size per se, it's how quickly can the brain process, or how quickly and efficiently the brain can process stimuli. So you can do this in simple ways. You can give someone different visual stimuli, measure their brain reactions via EEG, and look at how quickly it happens, and that's positively correlated with IQ. Similarly, if the brain uses less glucose to solve a problem, that's also positively correlated with IQ. So that's another indirect measure of neural efficiency. Right? It needs less resources to solve the same problem. So those are different lines of evidence for genetic and biological factors being relevant. What about the environment? So one obvious thing to point out is, as I said, the heritability is not 1, so right there we know that the environment is playing a role. But the most dramatic piece of evidence for the environment playing a role is the Flynn effect, which has already been mentioned. This was discovered by James Flynn, who, I like Flynn because he did his PhD in philosophy, so he's like me, he's got kind of his hand in both pots. So he's a philosopher by training, and sometimes it takes an outside eye to notice something. I mentioned that IQ tests are renormed every number of years to make sure that the average is always 100. What Flynn did was ask, well, what if we ignore the restandardizations and just look at raw scores? And what he found was, as I've mentioned, IQ scores have been going up quite dramatically since we've been keeping records. In the last 100 years, about 30 points, which is a huge effect. So as he'll say in the video, 70 is by convention the cutoff for having an intellectual disability. I apologize, he uses the old-fashioned term, it's an older video. And 100 is the average. So 30 points is a huge gain. And as I've already said, there's one thing we know it can't be due to, and that's genes. Genetic changes via evolution take much longer than a handful of generations, so it has to be due to some kind of change in the environment. Now, as the video mentioned, education likely plays a role. Things like improved nutrition and less malnourishment. If you grow up malnourished, your brain doesn't develop properly. Healthcare too, if there's more diseases, various diseases can impinge on neural development. And what this is a good reminder that genetic does not mean unchangeable, or genetically influenced does not mean unchangeable. The same is true of height. Height is very heritable, but height has also been going up for similar reasons. So I think I said this back in the section on weight, if there's the curve in 1920 for IQ scores, if you were to do twin studies at the time, you would likely find that a large amount of the variation at that time is influenced by genes. And as we've seen, if we look today, there's evidence that within the variation that exists today, a large amount of it is genetically influenced. But the average difference between 1920 and today is 100% due to the environment. So I mentioned education, nutrition, and healthcare as possible sources. Flynn thinks that cultural changes also matter, that the kinds of problems we're used to solving and the ways of thinking that we're used to, kind of habits of mind, also matter. So I'll show a video of him talking about that. He has a bit of a dry voice. He's an older gentleman. He actually just passed away, I think, a year or two ago, but very important psychologist. So watch some footage of him. Okay, any questions about the Flynn effect? Okay, so the book then talks about some concrete examples of different ways in which the environment influences intelligence or IQ scores. And a helpful term here that I'm stealing from the book I used at the U of A is reaction range. This is a theoretical idea that what genes give you is a range of outcomes that you could get. And then environmental influence will decide where you go on that reaction range. One example, I didn't use this in my Monday class, but imagine like everyone ordered from the least musically gifted to the most musically gifted. Now, you all know practice, etc., environmental things matter for how well you'll turn out, but I think everyone here would probably suspect that genes matter too, to the extent, and there are twin studies providing evidence that that's true, but what they may provide something like a reaction range. So mine might be like here, I didn't practice that much, if I had practiced more, maybe I'd be a bit better, but I was never going to be Whitney Houston, probably. But even for someone who's gifted, I'm sure Whitney Houston spent hours and hours and hours practicing, and without the kinds of things in the environment she had, she would not have become as great as she did. So that's the right way to think about what genes give. Now, so one example is poverty. So poverty lowers IQ scores. You can look at adoption studies where kids are adopted from low SES families to high SES families, SES meaning socioeconomic status. And the increase you get is something in the range of 12 to 18 points. So quite a substantial effect, showing that being in an impoverished environment harms one's performance on IQ scores. There's different reasons for that. One concrete thing is toxins in the environment. So famously in many parts of the United States, there's still lead in the pipes, and ingesting lead turns out to not be good for the old brain. You'll all be pleased to know there's evidence that going to school for a longer period of time is associated with gains in IQ tests. Now, here we have to be careful. So the correlation between number of years in school and IQ is quite high. But remember what we said in chapter 2, correlation is not causation. So school and IQ tests are correlated, so it could be that going to school causes you to be smarter. Or it could be that, hey, smart kids are the ones who go to college, right? Or it could be there's some third variable that influences both, like socioeconomic status, for example. So it could be that being rich makes you smarter, or at least being not poor makes you smarter and makes you stay in school longer. So how do we find out about causation? So we're not going to do the experiment where we randomly assign people to two conditions, the college condition and the don't go to college condition. So what we can instead rely on is what are sometimes called natural experiments. So sometimes people get prevented from going to school because there's a natural disaster or war or some other thing that keeps you out of school, and look at what effect that has. It doesn't have the same control as an experiment in the lab, but you can make some inferences from that. And there was a really good meta-analysis of this kind of data, and the range of estimates there were that each year of additional schooling is associated with 1 to 5 additional IQ points. So you add up the years, that can be a pretty big effect. Although the range there is 1. next term is gene-environment interactions. So there are different ways this can happen. So I mentioned earlier that heritability tends to go up with age. So if you use the standard twin study methods, you find the numbers you get are higher as the person gets older. That might surprise some of you, and to make that concrete, what that means is, as you grow up, you are becoming more similar to your identical twin that you've never met. If it turns out that at birth you had a twin that got sent to another family, the older you get, the more alike you are to that twin. One way that could, so that's just true, you can just look at the correlations, but why is that true? One reason could be a gene-environment interaction. It could be that as you get older, you have more control over your environment, right? You leave mom's house and you decide who your friends are, what kinds of things you do for fun. Mom can't tell you anymore to, not do X. And you may be choosing those because of genetic traits that you have, but those, so, let's say that you're, academically inclined, and as you get older, you choose to spend more time at the chess club and less time playing sports. Your IQ may go up as a result, and it's because you have more control over the kind of environment that you're exposed to. So that's one example of a gene-environment interaction. And this relates to a very important caveat about heritability. I've already made a number of caveats, but another one is heritability doesn't tell you anything about mechanism. So when we say something like, IQ is 50 to 70% heritable, what many people assume is, that must mean the genes build the brain to be smarter. But we don't actually know much of anything about how genes produce traits. And what could be going on is something like this. It could be that the gene produces one trait, let's call it trait 1, which then elicits a response from the environment, which then produces trait 2. So here's an example. So we know that extroversion, so how outgoing and socially confident you are, is heritable. Around 40 to 50% heritable. Again, the assumption people have is, the genes must, make the nucleus accumbens such that it gets tickled more by people or something like that. But it could be something like this, and I'm basically making this up, but the point is it's equally compatible with the data. It could be that what the genes in question actually do is make you better looking. So trait 1 might be attractiveness. So the genes make you better looking. What does that do? That elicits a different response from the environment. Life is unfair. If you're better looking, and you talk to people, what do? They're more pleasant. Like, oh yes, whatever. They show more interest in you. And as a result, that causes you to be more socially confident and extroverted. Because you're sort of conditioned to think, yeah, when I talk to people, they'll be nice back. Again, I just made that up. But the point is, you don't know how the gene produces the trait, just because it's heritable. As I say, it could be that what's actually going on is a gene-environment interaction, where the genes produce a trait, which then elicits a response from the environment. Does that idea make sense? Okay, I have some bad news. There's some more numbers you have to know. Well, I guess earlier I gave you an equation, but here are some numbers that you have to memorize. Don't worry about the decimal at the end. Let's focus on, we just kind of cancel that out. This is approximately the distribution of IQ scores. So we've already seen this in chapter 2. This is a bell curve or normal distribution. This is somewhat idealized. It won't be exactly like this, but it's a good first approximation. So for IQ, at least modern IQ tests, The average is 100, mean, and the standard deviation is 15. So remember that standard deviation is how far away on average are scores from the mean. At least for the purposes of this class, that's good enough. So what this means in this case is 68% of people will be between 85 and 115. So most people are close to the middle. Scores then become more and more rare as you go closer to the tails. So 70 by convention is the cutoff for an intellectual disability, although there's some caveats to that. And 130 is by convention the cutoff for giftedness. And a little over 2% of people are above 130 or below 70. Ignore the decimal at the end. So you should know these numbers. I won't include questions where it's a close call, but you should have a rough sense of how many people are in these different ranges. So let's talk a bit about the extremes of intelligence. So one interesting finding about the extremes in the positive direction is they start to have diminishing returns. So for intellectually demanding things, like let's say graduate school or medical school, if you are not above a kind of threshold, programs like that will be difficult. But when you get really high, you start to get, as I say, diminishing returns. There is a weaker correlation between IQ and performance when you get to the very high end. A way to think about that is, there's a real difference between 100 and 130. If you're at 100 or 85, graduate school will be difficult. But the difference between 130 and 160 is not as consequential. So there's statistical evidence for this, but I saw this firsthand when I was doing my master's. The two people I was closest with, so we traded master's theses and would give each other feedback. One of them got perfect on the GRE verbal, which is highly correlated with IQ. It's a standardized test to get into graduate school, and perfect is very rare. It's only for people applying to graduate school. The other guy would joke about his mediocre performance on the GRE, but he was still smart enough to get in. So when the three of us would argue, the perfect GRE guy, you could tell he was verbally quicker, right? His brain just worked faster, because this was philosophy. And the way that philosophy students bond is we argue about things that don't matter. So the three of us often did this. But when it came time to write the master's thesis, the second student, who had okay performance on the GRE, produced a much better document. What he was extremely hardworking. He would write the paper, read it, reread it until every comma he had given thought to, and you could tell when you read it. By the end of the master's program, he had, I think, 4 first author publications. Which that's good even for the end of a PhD. So 4, these are peer-reviewed articles that are very hard to publish. So my point is that once you get past a certain threshold, IQ scores stop mattering as much. Some have made an analogy with performance in the NFL as a lineman and weight, where weight is the analog of IQ. If you're 130 pounds, you are probably not going to be successful as a lineman. Right? Just as if you have an IQ of 75, you're probably not going to have success as a physicist. But once you get past a certain point, if you look at the people who are actually in the NFL, the correlation between weight and performance is pretty small. It's other variables that matter at that point. So those are my thoughts on kind of the high end. What do we have to know, or what's important to know about the low end? So about 2% of people are below 70. And this, by convention, is the cutoff for having an intellectual disability. But the DSM-5, which we'll talk more about at the end of the course, DSM-5 is like standard manual for diagnosing mental disorders. The DSM-5 has added the criterion that you have to also have impairment in functioning. Some people have IQs of below 70, but they live normal lives, work a job, live by themselves. Can't really tell if you talk to them there's anything wrong. Nowadays, they would not be diagnosed as having an intellectual disability. You have to have both a low IQ, low defined as below 70, and have impaired functioning. So here are the different ranges when you zoom in on those below 70. Don't worry about the details, but what I do want you to know is there are different causes when you look at the different levels. So 50 to 70 is considered mild, a mild intellectual disability. Most of these people you would not be able to tell by talking to them. And that's the vast majority of people with intellectual disabilities. So it gets more and more rare the further out you go. So that's the biggest category. And mild intellectual disabilities tend to run in families. They're, like a lot of the rest of the variation in intelligence, heritable. So if you look at the average IQ of the siblings of people with intellectual disabilities in that range, they tend to also be low. If you go down to profound, this is below 20, so this is extremely low. These are people who cannot live on their own and support themselves. Intellectual disabilities that extreme tend to not be heritable. They tend to not run in families. The average IQ of a sibling of someone with that level of IQ is usually average. So those tend to be the result of more freakish things. So the mom has a disease while she's pregnant with the kid, some kind of oxygen deprivation, or a mutation specific to that person, those kinds of things. So mild intellectual disability is typically heritable, profound typically not. One specific cause of intellectual disability is Down syndrome. So Down syndrome is a specific condition caused by an extra chromosome. So most people have 23 pairs of chromosomes, so 46 total, 23 from mom, 23 from dad. People with Down syndrome have 47, which you might think, well, that sounds good, like extra, superhero, extra DNA, but this impairs development. Most, though not all, people with Down syndrome also have an intellectual disability. The average IQ is around 50. Now, in theory, and actually in reality, if you go far enough in the curve, you will find some cases of people with Down syndrome who have average or even above average IQ scores, but that's rare. The curve is much lower. Okay, any questions about the extremes of intelligence? Okay. The next section is, whenever I come to this section, it's the most difficult to talk about, and I'm going to go through it slowly and carefully so as not to invite misunderstanding, and that's group differences in IQ scores. So these have been known about for a long time, and as you can imagine, they are the subject of a lot of controversy. So I'll start with the basic findings, and these are well replicated and not in doubt. If you give large samples of people, and most of these studies are done in the United States, if you give large groups of people IQ tests, you will find average differences between ethnic groups. And of course, the key word there is average. If you want to visualize it, they would look something like this. So, overlapping normal distributions, meaning that every group will still have people at every level, but if you compute the mean, you will find differences. They work out to something like this. So the book talks about this. For African Americans, the average used to be around 85. The gap has narrowed to some degree, now closer to 90. The average in the United States for Americans of European descent is more like 100. For Americans who are East Asian, maybe 103 to 105. And for American Jews, there are different estimates and fewer studies, but 107 to 115 is what you'll find in the literature. So that's the finding. Now, what's the reason for this? One idea we've already talked about is the possibility of test bias. So some items, especially in earlier versions of the test, seem to be better measures of class than intelligence. But one way of trying to improve the tests and eliminate bias is using an objective metric of bias, which is predictive bias. A test has predictive bias if the predictive validity is different for the different groups. So remember that important term from earlier, predictive validity, which is a type of criterion validity. So predictive validity is, does the test predict something that it should predict? So in the case of IQ, the standard thing is grades. So here's an example where there is good evidence of predictive validity, the SAT. Now there's some controversy about this too, but it's a helpful example. The point of the SATs is to predict school grades. Like that's literally why they're designed. So this is a standardized test that's used in the United States. Men do better on the SAT on average, but women get better grades in college. So in that case, you could argue the SAT is predictively biased against women. It's under-predicting their performance. In the case of modern IQ tests, they do not have this kind of predictive bias. The predictive validity is equal for different ethnic groups. So the question then is, what causes these average differences? There was a famous, or maybe infamous is the right word, book called The Bell Curve that the textbook mentions. What it doesn't mention is there is actually a response to the bell curve written by the American Psychological Association. It's still worth reading. And what they argue is that there is little evidence that bears on the question of the cause of the ethnic group differences, but the little evidence that does exist points against a genetic origin of the differences. So there's consensus in the field that these differences exist, but they are probably not genetic in origin, is the standard view. The APA report mentions two interesting studies. Now, these are small samples, not conclusive, but they point against the idea that the ethnic group differences are genetic in origin. One was done in Germany after World War II. So, I assume you all know what World War II is. So, the Americans and Canadians and British and the French invaded Germany from the west and then occupied the country afterwards. And in the American sector, well, throughout the sectors, some of the troops, while they were stationed there, hooked up with the local German women on their off time. And when their tour was over, they went back home. Many of these German women had kids. Some of the American servicemen were African American, and some were white. So these kids are then either half black or just white. And crucially, they are all raised in the same environment. They're all raised by German single mothers. So it was a really interesting case to see if the difference remained. In that study, there was no difference between the white kids and the half-black kids. So that points against a genetic cause. Another set of studies that the textbook mentions looks at the percentage of European ancestry in African Americans in the United States. So most African Americans have some percentage of European ancestry, and if it's European genes that are the cause of differences in IQ, then the African Americans with more white ancestry should have higher IQs, but they didn't find that, so that's also something that points against a genetic cause. So given that this is a contentious area, I want to wrap this section up by emphasizing 4 things that we know for sure. As I say, these studies are somewhat small in sample, but 4 crucial takeaways to remember that we know for sure. 1, as I've already said, but it's worth emphasizing, the differences are only on average. One example I use to kind of emphasize this point, think about the last 3 presidents of the United States. So one of them is a repeat. So someone named for me, the last 3 presidents of the United States, including the repeats.
Trump, Obama, and Biden?
Yeah, Trump, Obama, and Biden. Now, this is not a politics class. I won't make any comment about policy. But as far as intelligence, I think there's no question, even if you're conservative, that Obama was much smarter than the other 2. And if you have any doubt about this, you just have to listen to them speak for 5 minutes, and it's clear. So that's reinforces this first point. Another one, which I have listed in the key terms, this one you may have to think about to let it sink in, but heritability within groups does not, so I'll do like an, does not imply, so I'll do like an arrow with an X through it, heritability between groups. So some of you might be thinking, well, wait a second, how can the group differences not be heritable? We just saw that there's lots of evidence that IQ is a strongly genetically influenced trait. Doesn't that mean that the group differences are also heritable? The twin study estimates that you get are always within a given population. So you look at a population, you can estimate the amount of the variation that's caused by genes, and the estimates you get are fairly high. But that doesn't imply that that group differences are also genetically caused. And here's an example that you may have to think about, but it'll, I think, be helpful. I'm stealing this from Richard Lewontin. Suppose I took a fistful of seeds of the same stock, same types of seeds, and I randomly put them into 2 handfuls, and one I put in good soil, and the other I put in bad soil. So being, of course, an analog for the environment. What you would find, let's say it was seeds for blades of grass, is that the seeds, blades of grass in the good soil would be taller than the blades of grass in the bad soil. Now, height in plants is strongly genetically influenced. If I looked at the difference, within the good soil, the reason this one is taller than this one and this one's taller than this one is going to largely be a function of the genes. And same here, if I look at the differences between these blades of grass. If I did twin studies with blades of grass, I would find high heritability. But in this case, the average difference between the good soil blades of grass and the bad soil blades of grass is 100% a function of the environment. I set it up like that. So that's just to reinforce the logical point that heritability within groups does not imply heritability between groups. My students sometimes struggle with this point, so any questions about point number 2? Okay, point number 3. We know that environmental changes can produce differences as large as, it's getting long, the ethnic group differences. So, I mean, one example we already talked about is the Flynn effect. This is over 30 points of change that occurred that was 100% due to the environment. That doesn't prove that the ethnic group differences are also due to the environment, but it shows that differences of that size can be produced environmentally. One more concrete example, there are actually cases of particular immigrant groups where this happened. So at the beginning of the century, Italian immigrants, so my people, at least some of my people, the average IQ was around 85. But when Italian immigrants were more poor back then, when they became more integrated into mainstream American society, the scores improved and now are the same average, 100. And this was again entirely environmental. And then the last point, which I'll close this section off with, and this is reason to be skeptical that the average IQ differences are genetic in origin. Genetic differences between groups are small. This is something about which there is not debate. So, I am not a geneticist, but all the geneticists I hear talk about this summarize the data as follows. All humans on Earth, 99.9% genetically identical. And if you zoom in on that 0.1% of difference, so this is all human genetic variation, most of that variation exists in every ethnic group. Around 10% of it, give or take, is between group variation. What that means is, if everyone on Earth were to die, except for, like, let's say, I don't know, people in Kenya or something, the vast majority of genetic variation would still exist. Human racial or ethnic differences are visually very easy to detect, but skin color, hair texture is only a very small percentage of genetic variation. And to talk about that last point, because as I say, I'm not a geneticist, I have a real biologist talking about it. Okay. Any questions about that section? So as I say, a little bit of a difficult section to talk about, but I think by the time you get to the end, not as scary as it may have seemed at first. So we're close to the end of the chapter. There's also a discussion of average sex differences in these tests. I already mentioned that if you look at total IQ score, the average is the same, 100 for males and 100 for females. If you zoom in on subtests, there are some differences, though they wash out when you get the total. So one that's been widely studied is males on average do better on tests of mental rotation, so like mentally rotating objects, so kind of spatial type problems. Women do better on tests of verbal fluency, so there's tests like how many words can you think of that start with the letter T? You see how many they can do. Also, object location memory, so you show them an array of shapes, and then you block them all. How many can you remember? On average, women outperform men on those. There's a few others that the book briefly mentions. You don't have to worry about the details, but what you should know is there's no difference in the average overall, but there is in some of the subtests. Another one that's relevant to some of the distinctions we made in chapter 2 is there's a difference in variability. So this is not a frequency distribution. The y-axis is percentage. So of the people at that IQ score, what percentage are male and female? And what this is showing is that the male distribution is wider, meaning more in the extremes. So more that are very low or very high. So for example, for IQs of 60, just under 60% are male. And for IQs of 140, again around 60% male. As is sometimes summarized, more geniuses, more idiots. And then one final one that's I'm sure many of you will not be surprised by. There's a difference in, you wouldn't call it intelligence, maybe you'd call it stupidity, risk-taking. There's a lot of studies finding that males on average are less risk-averse, so more likely to take risks. And one funny example of evidence for this is the Darwin Awards. Someone actually did a statistical analysis of the Darwin Awards. How many of you have heard of the Darwin Awards? So these are awards that are given to people who die doing very dumb things, thereby taking their genes out of the gene pool. And they've analyzed one example that I read about, someone wanted to clean their chimney, and so they were lowering a brush attached to a chain into the chimney, but it kept getting stuck at the top. So this person reasoned, I need to attach something small and heavy to the end of the chain so it will go down and clean more effectively. He decided to attach a grenade to the end of the chain and thought that welding it was the best way to do it. He didn't survive that experiment. So anyways, back to the sex difference. The vast majority, nearly all of the winners are men. So as I said to my U of A class, women aren't smarter than men, but men are dumber than women. That's the takeaway. Okay. And then a final thought, this is something I close this chapter with. There's an old parable about a guy walking down the street at night with only a few lampposts, and he drops his keys. And he starts pacing around one lamppost trying to find his keys. And someone walks by and says, what the hell are you doing? And he says, well, I'm trying to find my keys. And he says, why are you only looking under the lamppost? You could have dropped it anywhere on the street. And the man says, I'm looking here because that's where I can see. And that's a pretty good analogy for psychology. We're limited to what we can measure. As I said earlier, IQ explains only something like 25% of the variation in grades. But there's a lot we're missing out on. It's only what we can measure. So I'd like to close this chapter with that. Any questions about this chapter? Okay, I will see some of you tomorrow for test review, and all of you, hopefully, for the test next week. Good luck with studying. Please ask any questions then.